In 2008, the Royal Anthropological Institute published a scholarly volume entitled Early Human Kinship. And it stemmed from a 2005 workshop held in Greginog in Wales as part of the From Lucy to Language project, which is a massive project, several £1 million invested in it to work out how it is that we became human over evolutionary time, going right back to Lucy, to the Australopithecines science. I was at that event in 2005, as was Camilla here. And for all of us anthropologists who deal with these questions of prehistory and ask questions like, what was the family like when human culture first became established? Was the marriage, was it monogamous? How were kids looked after and all that? All of us are aware that someone's been here before. We're all aware that a massively influential text was published in the late 1880s by none other than Friedrich Engels, Karl Marx's faithful companion and colleague. So that's kind of part of our mythology. As soon as anyone talks about early human kinship, we're all aware, one way or the other, that we have to know about Engels' great work. And some people disagree with it, some people agree with it, but it's massively part of our history. And Engels argued, and he argued lots of things, by the way. I've got the book here. And I have to say, parts of this text, The Origin of the Family, Private Property in the State, is just unreadable today. You can't read it because the hackles rise. It's about features of different races and the amount of meat you eat having an impact on your brain, and then the history is divided into different periods. And the students today, they read these things and think, let's find out about savagery, let's look up Engels on savagery, and then maybe we're not interested in savagery, we want to go to barbarism. I mean, to be fair to Engels, he was trying to turn those labels round. He was trying to say, almost like the noble savage, he was saying what people call savagery was actually wonderfully civilized, same with what people call barbarism, that was maybe even more civilized. So to be fair to Engels, he was just using the language which is around, and trying to kind of reclaim it, I suppose you could say. But it still is very difficult reading for those reasons, because the language just does put you off. So I'm not going to bother about all that. I'm going to cut to the quick and just touch on what the fundamental point Engels was making. His fundamental point is that kinship was originally matrilineal and matrilocal, and you might think, well, so what? But the point is that women, according to Engels, lived with their mother, their sisters, their brothers, and motherhood was collective, and child care was collective. So a woman would live with her sisters and her mum, and her husband would come and visit, but he wouldn't have any power, and the authority in the family would be the mother, of course, and her sisters, and perhaps her mum, grandmother. But also, if there was a male authority figure in the family, it would be the mother's brother, the husband being, of course, just a visitor. And that's what happens in a matrilineal, matrilocal system. In the early years of the 20th century, 20, 30 years after Engels' book, especially following the Russian Revolution, this text became demonized in the West. And the whole idea that motherhood could be collective became denounced as Bolshevism, and deemed to be so inflammatory that you really, it was so much part of Marxism, so much part of the canon, that no one could deal with these questions that Engels was dealing with in a neutral way. And what happened following the First World War, and especially in the 20s, was that this was a time when anthropology was becoming established in the universities. You could be professionally an anthropologist, and as anthropology in that modern sense was being established, what happened was that family values took centre stage, with anthropologists competing with each other to prove that group motherhood is an illusion. You cannot look after children collectively. The only way in which a child can be brought up is in a nuclear family with one mum and a dad who's faithful within the individual nuclear family. And that the question of the idea of debating those issues was so was deemed so polemical, so political, so dangerous that nobody did anymore. And so when this book came out, as a result of that 2005 conference in Wales, that conference, that workshop, it was the first time for 100 years, as far as I know, that the issues raised by Engels had been seriously considered by paleoanthropologists, archaeologists, evolutionary psychologists, and social anthropologists interested in the deep past. And I published a chapter in this book, which I'm very pleased with, called Early Human Kinship Was Matrilineal. You can download it quickly from the website and read all the details if you're interested. The cover of the book, Early Human Kinship. After a century of just like a deep consensus on the part of all wings of anthropology that Engels was wrong, that it's completely wrong to argue that early human kinship was matrilineal. Everybody agreed that the family was not matrilineal to begin with, and if anything it was patriarchal and patrilineal, and dominant schools of anthropology were arguing that actually the nuclear family is absolutely basic and fundamental. I wrote this paper and published it. Early human kinship was matrilineal, and to my kind of astonishment, I suppose, I realised at this event in Great Wales that most of my colleagues kind of agreed. They didn't have a fit when they heard me speak, and in many ways people agreed that actually this apparent consensus about the origin of the family against Engels, and most people agreed that actually there was no grounds for that consensus at all. So what happened was that just to sort of, I'm trying to be quick on this because it's not the main point of the talk this evening, but what happened was that anthropology became a profession, became a discipline, was taught at LSE actually, was the first place it was really in Europe that you had an academic department of anthropology. Bronislaw Malinowski had argued that the nuclear family was fundamental. He felt personally affronted by anyone who argued that it wasn't. Possibly the last major work in the spirit of Engels' The Origin of the Family was a book by Robert Griffo called The Mothers, a 3-volume encyclopedic work on similar topics, arguing again that matrilocal residence and matrilineal kinship were originally the norm. When that book came out in, I think it was 1927, Malinowski felt that it had to be denounced, and he duly did denounce it as nothing but dangerous propaganda. I'll come back a bit on that subject later on. But the result of all this has been that Engels' actual words, his actual text, has largely been forgotten. So, just to remind everybody, this is from Engels. He's talking about, his work was based on another lot of work by Lewis Henry Morgan. So Lewis Henry Morgan in 1859 published Systems of Affinity and Consanguinity of the Human Family. What happened was that Morgan was an American business lawyer. He was in New York in the 1840s and 50s, became adopted into the Iroquois tribe, got very interested in their systems of kinship and family life. The Iroquois had been matrilineal and matrilocal. They lived in these long houses, communal houses made of birch bark, and you'd have a line of women. Each fire each hearth was the responsibility of one of these women. They were related as sisters. You always had an old grandmother in charge of the whole household. All the stores would be held in common, and their husbands would be coming as visitors from outside, and they had to earn their keep. In order to have marital rights within the longhouse, they had to bring provisions. They had to do work, and one of the things they had to do was bring hunted meat. Although the Iroquois were also horticulturists, they were also gardening. But the fundamental thing was that women never left their mother and their sisters, and their guardians remained the brothers, and the children were looked after collectively. And Morgan himself argued that this roughly this system was everywhere in the world, the system before the rise of the nuclear family, private property, the state, and patriarchy. So Engels writes about how Morgan was the first to rediscover the centrality of the matrilineal clan as a fundamental family, and more than family, it's family and social and economic institution of, quotes, primitive society. And he says, the rediscovery of the original mother right clan has the same significance for the history of primitive society as evolution has for biology, and Marx's theory of surplus value has for political economy. It enabled Morgan to outline for the first time the history of the family. Clearly this opens a new era in the treatment of primitive societies. And he went on to describe the mother right clan as the pivot around which the entire science turns. Well, when Engels supported that idea, he wasn't just influenced by Morgan. Karl Marx himself, in his early years, had been very interested in issues of sex and gender. And in 1844, when they were both very young, Engels and Marx had declared that, quote, the immediate, natural and necessary relationship of human being to human being is the relationship of man to woman. From this relationship, the whole cultural level of man can be judged. So Marx and Engels kind of left those issues, which they dealt with in their early years, aside, especially when Marx began to write Das Kapital and got more and more deeply into what he called the shit of economics. But when Morgan's book came out, suddenly Engels and Marx realised that they discovered something which kindled their enthusiasm for these issues that they'd written about earlier on. And when Marx discovered Morgan's book, Ancient Society, as well as his earlier work, Marx and Engels took Morgan's work as confirmation of the things they believed in at an earlier stage. So Marx and Engels in the German ideology had contrasted primitive communism with the subsequent emergence of property. So they were arguing that first of all you had communism of everything really, an element of sexual communism in childcare, communism in sharing of land and resources. And then, at a certain point in history, and they believed connected with herding, pastoralism, with ownership of cattle, you got the first breakup of that commune. And they talked about the nucleus, the first form of talked about the emergence of private property. The nucleus, the first form of which lies in the family, where wife and children are the slaves of the husband. So according to Morgan, the domestication of cattle disempowered women, breaking up their earlier sisterhood. What would happen, according to Morgan, was that ownership of cattle meant that a woman could be bargained for with cattle. So that whereas previously a man would have to work for his marital rights, he'd have to visit the lodge where his wife lived, perform bride service for his marital rights, keep bringing provisions. Once you had a lot of cattle, you could offer the cattle to the woman's relatives, and if they were satisfied with the cattle, there was enough of the cattle, they would let her go, let their daughter, their sister go, in exchange for the cattle, Then she would move away from where she'd been before, move to her husband's village in exchange for the cattle. And of course, in the new her new residence, she'd be isolated from her kin and under the control of her husband and his relatives. And this change, according to Morgan, reversed the position of the wife and the mother in the household. And this is Morgan's words: she was of a different clan to her children. She'd been pulled because when she moves to her new residence, in exchange for the cattle, her children belonged to her husband and his family instead of to her clan and her family. She was of a different clan to her children. She'd been pulled away to live with her husband. This is all quote from Morgan. As well as being of a different clan from her husband, she was isolated from her kin in the separate and exclusive house of her husband. Her new condition tended to subvert and destroy the power and influence which descend from the female line and that the joint tenement houses had created. And then Engels wrote about that transition and added a political impact to what Morgan had been writing about. And so this is Engels' words from this book, The Origin of the Family. The man took command in the home also. The woman was degraded and reduced to servitude. She became a slave of his lust and every instrument for the production of children. And then, crucially for Marx's theory, Engels wrote, the first class opposition that appears in history coincides with the development of the antagonism between man and woman in monogamous marriage, and the first class oppression coincides with that of the female sex by the male. So very clear statement. If you're interested in the origin of class society, the first form of class oppression is the oppression of a wife by her husband. And the first form of private property is marriage, the ownership by a man of his wife and her children. So that was the theory of Morgan and Engels, incorporated into Marxist doctrine. And from about 1920 onwards, the theory was denounced, ridiculed, and it's hard to. Well, two things are hard to visualize today. First of all, it's difficult to remember often how convincing to just about everybody it had been in the 1880s and 90s that early human kinship was matrilineal. I mean, just about every single scientist, every prehistorian agreed that you originally had matriarchy, and then there was a great transition from matriarchy to patriarchy. And then in the 1920s, the pendulum swung right back the other way, and Engels' work was completely forgotten. And there was actually even more astonishing, I think, is that Marxists, people who call themselves Marxist intellectuals, just abandoned that part of the theory. That doesn't happen in the Soviet Union because, of course, you had a state kind of ideology. Marxism became a kind of state religion. But intellectual Marxists in the West just stopped defending Engels from that point on, from the 20s on. And of course it's possible, isn't it? When I was finding out about all this in the 60s, I kept thinking, well, of course, if Engels is wrong, if Engels got it wrong, and maybe he got it wrong because Morgan got it wrong, why should Marxists carry on defending it? It's just wrong. It's antiquated stuff. It's all completely outdated. Maybe Malinowski was right. Maybe we should forget all that and realise that actually early human kinship can't possibly be matrilineal, can't possibly have had group motherhood. Maybe we just need to put science first. But I still think we might have thought that perhaps the intellectuals who gave up on that theory might have explored a little deeper. So what was the evidence that this whole theory was wrong? So most of my work in anthropology, actually, over the last 50 years, has been exploring precisely that question, and I don't think Engels was wrong at all. I think he's absolutely right. So that was just a summary of everything. But now I'm going to just go into a little bit more detail. So what becomes very clear when you look at this history is that it doesn't matter how much you're careful and conscientious and cite your sources and think that you're being scholarly and scientific, it's really difficult to avoid politics from dominating, even in areas which you think of as being just science, and actually probably no area more than this issue of the origin of the family, because it's so close to everyone's hearts. It's, everyone knows, it's like today, when a politician starts getting a little bit desperate, they'll start appealing to family values. Absolutely core, and if anyone challenges those family values, then, they're going to be pretty brave to do that. So Engels, following again Morgan, argued that right back in the very early stages of the family, there was no marriage, and sexual relationships were promiscuous. So we had this idea of primitive promiscuity. And what Engels noticed, he wrote it in a preface to I think the fourth edition of the Origin of the Family. He noticed that people were just outraged by the very idea that we could have come from such a terrible place as primitive promiscuity. And Engels commented, "It has become the fashion of late to deny the existence of this initial stage in the sexual life of mankind. The aim is to spare humanity this shame." And what had happened in the late 1880s and 1890s is that a Finnish anthropologist, Edward Westermark, set himself the job of defending family values, and he wrote a book called The History of Marriage, and he insisted that marriage has always been the fundamental institution. It's always been a sacred contract between one man and one woman. And Westermark decided to turn public opinion against the theory of primitive promiscuity by associating it with modern prostitution. He said if there was no marriage, there were no morals. If there were no morals, it means that all women were prostitutes, bargaining sex in exchange for economic favours. And to this Engels retorted, "To me it seems that all understanding of primitive conditions remains impossible so long as we regard them through brothel spectacles." But of course, once Engels' work had been incorporated into communist doctrine, these kinds of passions were aroused. So Morgan's Ancient Society, as Robert Lowy commented, Robert Lowy is a very influential American anthropologist who wrote a book called Primitive Society in 1920, and he described the history of this whole debate, saying that Morgan's Ancient Society attracted the notice of Marx and Engels, who accepted and popularised its evolutionary doctrines as being in harmony with their own philosophy. As a result, it was promptly translated into various European tongues, and German working men would sometimes reveal an uncanny familiarity with the Hawaiian and Iroquois mode of designating kin, matters not obviously connected with the proletarian revolution. So, as I was saying, social anthropologists like to imagine that their discipline became shaped in its modern form independently of Marxism, but it would be much more accurate to say that professional anthropology became shaped in opposition to the ideas of Marx and Engels. And that's not just me saying it. Marvin Harris wrote a very influential book, The History of Social Anthropology, and he writes that with Morgan's scheme incorporated into communist doctrine, the struggling science of anthropology crossed the threshold of the 20th century with a clear mandate for its own survival and well-being, exposed Morgan's scheme and destroyed the method on which it was based. I'm not sure it's a good idea for me to read into this paper. I'm trying to brief in this paper and stop myself going on too long. But I'm feeling I'd probably do better to just say it. Right. Lewis Henry Morgan, his fundamental contribution, which is recognised to this day, was the discovery of what's called classificatory kinship. So if you look up in an anthropology text, like a monograph describing pretty much any tribe, in Africa, Australia, wherever, the author of the book probably won't even explain to you that when the word mother is being used, it's being used in a classificatory sense, or the word father or son or daughter is being used in a classificatory sense. They just kind of assume that you take that for granted. But if you don't realise it, you'll get probably quite confused. Because basically, classificatory kinship is based on a very simple principle. It's called the equivalence of siblings. So what it means is that if you're a woman and you've got a sister, you are equivalent to your sister and she's equivalent to you. So if I'm a woman here, here's my sister, and my sister got a child. Because I'm equivalent to my sister's child is my child, and her child is, each of our children we share ownership of those children, and therefore, whatever term my sister uses to describe her child, my daughter, for example, I will use. So I will describe my daughter, even when, from our point of view, a Western point of view, it's not my daughter at all; it's my sister's daughter. So that was a fundamental discovery, and it's absolutely, it's correct. No one can deny that. Classificated kinship is the norm, except when societies become, when you begin to become urbanised, when you begin to get the development of the state, and particularly when patriarchal influence begins to creep in. But even to this day, as I said, almost any anthropological monograph will deal with kinship, kind of assuming that you understand that the terminology is classificatory. So what it means is that a child never has one mother. It will call various other women mummy or mother. And although that's terminological, there's more than just terminology to it. It's as if the sisters, they don't want to distinguish between mine and thine. It's like if my sister's child falls over, I don't say, oh, that's just my sister's child, I don't care so much. It's my child that's fallen over, and I'm going to look after it, pick it up, and act as a mother towards that child. So the children have got they've got mothers, of course, but in an important sense, the mothers are a group. You have group motherhood. Children are looked after collectively. And it was that idea that parenthood could be made collective, which was deemed most dangerous by Bronislaw Malinowski, the founder of social anthropology as it exists today. So this is a radio broadcast by Malinowski, revealing his state of mind. This was in 1932. So he's describing now Bachofen, who wrote a book called Mother Right, describing Morgan, describing Engels, and describing how in the late part of the 19th century, pretty much everyone agreed that early human kinship was matrilineal and that motherhood was collective. So he says, a whole school of anthropologists from Bachofen on have maintained that the maternal clan was a primitive domestic institution. In my opinion, as you know, this is entirely incorrect. But an idea like that, once it is taken seriously and applied to modern conditions, becomes positively dangerous. I believe that the most disruptive element in the modern revolutionary tendencies is the idea that parenthood can be made collective. If once we came to the point of doing away with the individual family as the pivotal element of our society, we should be faced with a social catastrophe compared with which the political upheaval of the French Revolution and the economic changes of Bolshevism are insignificant. The question, therefore, as to whether group motherhood is an institution which ever existed, whether it is an arrangement which is compatible with human nature and social order, is of considerable practical interest. And Malinowski declared it. He said, it's my scholarly duty to prove to the best of my ability that marriage and the family have been, are, and will remain the foundations of all human society. And what Malinowski also did, he said, it's wrong to study these questions. It's wrong to study evolution. It's wrong to ask about early human institutions. But he warns us, even if you should study the origins of the family, you'd still find out that it was, that the earliest form of kinship was individual, and that the family was individual. So I would rather discountenance any speculation about the origins of marriage or anything else that contributes to them, even indirectly. So he's saying, don't study these questions, but rest assured that if you did study them, you'd find bourgeois family values at the root of it all. But don't study it, because I know the answer was already done. So what then happened was, Malinowski having established that point, perhaps I should explain how Malinowski put it. He said, all right, okay, maybe the Trobriand Islanders, he studied the Trobriand Islanders, maybe some other people, they say my sister's daughter is my daughter, or a child will say my mother's sister is my mother. He said, all right, that's just ideology. they're just being foolish. Because really, every single child is always born from the womb of one mother. That's true, isn't it, you say? And so therefore, really, in real scientific terms, motherhood is always individual. And also, this woman will have sex, and she'll have sex with a man, and it's a man. And he argues on that basis that if these tribal people think in collectivist terms, if they think that a child can be looked after by two or more mothers, if you probe deeply, you'll find the natural thing is that kinship is individual. And he followed Westermarck, actually, in saying that actually, Westermarck believed, by the way, that gorillas and orangutans and chimpanzees are monogamous. And so therefore, it's natural to be monogamous, and the individual family is just inherited by early humans from our primate ancestors. So while Malinowski was doing that in Britain, in other parts of the world, the onslaught against Engels' Origin of the Family was running its course. So in the United States, the major figure was Franz Boas. And Boas originally, he accepted the Morgan-Engels scheme, and he was working among the Kwakiutl, the northwest coast of America, on Vancouver Island, in fact. So what was the background of what Boas did was this, that it was well known, everyone agreed with this, that you could find societies in transition from one line of descent to another. And every single case where people had documented that there had been a transition, say, over the last 50 years or over 100 years, every single case, the transition was always going one way. It was always from matrilineal descent to patrilineal. So you could find societies that were still matrilineal, still matrilocal. Maybe they were still matrilocal, but they'd switched the resident rule to patrilocal, so that although formally the kinship system was matrilineal, in practice women now lived with their husbands. Maybe later on the descent rule would switch over to correspond to that switch in the residence rule. But wherever you looked, you had a one-way directionality from matrilineal to patrilineal, which of course would mean that the matrilineal, wherever you found a kind of mix, the matrilineal elements were always the older. So what Boas had to do to discredit that whole theory was find one example somewhere of movement in the other direction. Could he find a single case of a society which moved from patrilineal to matrilineal? Because if he was able to do that, the whole Morgan-Engels theory would be discredited, because if it was possible in one case, then maybe it was possible in all cases, and therefore wherever you found matrilineal, it could be it wasn't old at all. Perhaps it was a recent development. Perhaps the people had suddenly become matrilineal. So he needed to find that one case, and he decided that the Kwakiutl were that case. So he said that the Kwakiutl today had a purely female law of descent, but the organisation must have been at one time a purely paternal one. So he said they would move from being purely paternal to being purely maternal, so therefore the matrilineal arrangements were recent and new. So for the very first time, a unilineal descent system had been found in shaping in the reverse direction to the one that Morgan and Engels had specified. For some reason, that claim that the Kwakiutl had moved in the other direction was accepted by everybody, except when he read the small print. So, in fact, it wasn't even accepted by Boas's closest and most loyal student, Robert Lowe, who I mentioned earlier, who wrote the book on primitive society. So in 1914, even Lowe admitted that the Vancouver Island data had been stretched to fit the case. Although the Kwakiutl facts are very interesting, as he put it, it's highly doubtful whether they have the theoretical significance ascribed to them. Most awkward was the fact that the groupings of the Kwakiutl, which Boas argued were clan groupings, they were called Nomayum, they were not unilineal descent groups at all. Every child got inherited certain features, certain rights and duties from his mother, certain from his father. It was bilineal, and therefore neither matrilineal nor patrilineal could be applied to the Kwakiutl. And for these reasons, as Lowe put it, the Kwakiutl conditions do not seem to furnish a favourable test case. So Lowe was the most loyal of the Boasians, but he wrote in an article which was immediately forgotten, no one ever read, that it wasn't a test case at all, that it was completely made up, the whole thing. And then Marvin Harris, the historian who wrote about the history of anthropological theory, he just writes this, and I'll read it out. The extreme interest in Boas's handling of the nomoeum stems from the fashion in which he and his students seized upon this case to destroy the supposed universal tendency for patrilineality to follow matrilineality, and at the same time to discredit the entire historical determinist position. On the basis of this one just drastically deficient case, they gradually diffused out of Schermerhorn Hall at Columbia through lecture, word of mouth, article and text the unquestioned dogma that Boas had proved that it was just as likely that patrilineality succeeded matrilineality as the reverse. So you had this dogma that it just made no difference. There was no laws of history, no change from one system to another. You could just be matrilineal, patrilineal, both, neither, move this way, move that way. It was kind of just, there was no regularities to be discerned. And so if that was true, of course, then obviously Engels' position doesn't make any sense. And then another major, I'm just reading out sort of the pillars of the 20th century consensus now. Another major contribution was by A.R. Radcliffe Brown, another big founder of the functionist school of anthropology alongside Bronislaw Malinowski. And he wrote a celebrated article in the 20s called The Mother's Brother in South Africa. So perhaps I'll just give you a background on that. In many African societies, as I'm sure most of you know, and many other societies as well, not just African, the authority figure for a child isn't its father. The male authority figure will be the mother's brother. And often the mother's brother is a very substantial authoritative figure, even when the kinship system is patrilineal. And what Engels assumed, what Morgan assumes, or what everyone else assumed that agreed with that earlier paradigm, evolutionist paradigm, was that, of course, you have a matrilineal system, it switches over gradually to patrilineal, but elements of the matrilineal logic survive under the new circumstances. And so if you find a society in Africa which is strongly patrilineal, but still the mother's brother has more authority over the child than its father, or maybe, or at any rate, major authority within certain domains, that simply proves that the transition to patrilineal hasn't been total. So the mother's brother relationship will be a survival of the earlier matrilineal logic. So rather as Boas, with the directionality argument, had to find one case where it didn't fit, Radcliffe Brown wanted to take this case of the mother's brother in South Africa, a particular tribe called the Tonga in Mozambique, and prove that you didn't need to assume that the mother's brother relationship was a survival from matrilineal. You could find some other explanation. So here we have the monograph on the Tonga by a certain anthropologist, the Reverend Juno, and he described these features of the Tonga, which need some kind of explanation. So, although inheriting clan membership from the father, Tonga children, on being weaned, went to live in their mother's brother's village. A man without patrilineal heirs would require a sister to remain in his settlement, her male offspring continuing his lineage. Even when a man did have patrilineal heirs, his sister's son could claim items from his own estate. The maternal uncle had a share in the bride price received for a sister's daughter. The maternal uncle and not the father officiated at the sacrifices and a young man's life crisis ceremonies. So the original author of this monograph, published in 1912, had interpreted these features as clear evidence that the Tonga were not straightforwardly patrilineal, but were embroiled in a complex transition from matrilineal to patrilineal, and the role of the maternal uncle was clearly a survival. Well, Radcliffe Brown, close colleague of Malinowski, needed to prove that whole theory wrong. And what he said was, okay, I've got a better explanation. And the explanation I've got is the equivalence of siblings. So he argued, okay, what it really is that because brother and sister are siblings, they are equivalent. And therefore, a child's relationship to its mother will slide over to the brother, because the brother is equivalent to the sister. And he described this principle of brother-sister unity as a universal sociological principle. It's just a fixed and invariant sociological principle called the equivalence of siblings. And so since a woman and her brother are equivalents, any human child's feelings towards its mother will naturally tend to include her brother as well. And Radcliffe Brown termed this universal psychic mechanism the extension of sentiments, and concluding after a few further observations that everything else was now satisfactorily explained. So can you see what I'm saying here? What Radcliffe Brown's saying, you don't need to assume matrimony. All you need to assume is something everybody knows, which is that siblings are equivalent, and therefore a child's relationship to its mother will be extended to the brother because brother and sister are everywhere, all around the world, equivalents. So I'll stop there and see if anyone's got any thoughts about what that might mean. Is it true that everywhere across the world, brother and sister are equivalents? Do you feel that you're close to your sister, if you're a man, close to your brother, to a woman, and that your child, because you are close to your brother, therefore your child belongs to your brother in some sense? Is that a universal sociological principle?
Not today.
No, the fact is, what happens is that a woman has to make a choice in all the different societies. You're either going to put your husband first as you grow up, or you're going to put your brother first. If you put your brother first, if you allocate responsibility for your children to your brother and exclude your husband, you can't put both first. You've got to make a choice. But if you put your brother first and your husband second, that's going to be difficult unless you live close to your mum, your sisters, your brother, you're relying on your brother. That whole logic of brother-sister solidarity is actually the same logic as gives you matrimony. So in any matrilineal society, you're going to stick with your kin, you're not going to move over and bond with your husband. Your husband will have to, if he wants to look after children, he have to go back to his sister and look after their children. So what Radical Brown's doing, he's taking a feature of matrimony, isolating it from matrimony, making it out as a universal sociological principle, and then using that to explain the mother's-brother relationship. So it's like a kind of tautology. He doesn't want to mention matrimony, he just mentions brother-sister solidarity, concealing from you the fact that brother-sister solidarity is matrimony. You'll only have brother-sister solidarity if you've got matrimony, or rather the same dynamic which makes a woman link with her brother, have solidarity with the brother defends his sister against the husband, that will give you matrimony. It's the same thing. So it's kind of a sleight of hand that Radcliffe Brown managed to use, because in order to conceal the fact that actually this was, the Tonga had moved between matrimony and just to say, it so happens that many historians have studied the Tonga. A major study was done by G.P. Murdoch, a big work on the history of African kinship systems. So it turns out, actually, everybody now knows that the Tonga were in fact, in the 18th and 19th centuries, moving from matrilineal to patrilineal. And the reason they were doing that is because of the introduction of cattle. And Ruth Mace, who actually, by the way, was here a few weeks ago at UCL, a major paper that she and her colleague did was on the transition from matrilineal to patrilineal in Africa. And the paper made very, very clear what the crucial factor was. It's cattle. As soon as you get cattle, that the number of cattle that the man has will enable him to negotiate with his bride and her relatives, and if they're satisfied with the cattle, then they'll let go of the woman, and so the cattle go this way, the woman goes that way. And we know that because actually there's a belt of Africa, in Central Africa, called the matrilineal belt, where the tsetse fly is a threat. And what tends to happen is that if a family have let their daughter go in exchange for the cattle, but then the cattle get infected by the tsetse fly, the cattle die, and the woman's relatives now, they want their daughter back, they want their sister back. So just the fact of the tsetse fly being active means a return back to matrimony. So it's just really proving that the original theory was absolutely correct.
So sorry, was this where dowry came from? Dowry.
Dowry is kind of the reverse of that, really.
You pay.
Dowry is the other direction.
Dowry is the opposite direction.
Dowry is the direction of the wife's people paying.
Cattle, the Lobola system, at least it means that the woman has a huge value. Before the family will let go of their sister, their daughter, they want some cattle in exchange. But the dowry is the other way around. It's like I'm trying to get rid of this sister. No one will have her. So I've got to add an extra lot of stuff to go with her, and then maybe this high-ranking husband will deign to accept her. So it's kind of almost the reverse. Dowry is almost the reverse of the bride or bride price.
So this testify thing, that would have a very corrosive effect on the relationships between those families.
No.
No?
Oh, well, the testify means the societies revert to being matrilineal. So the women are very pleased about testiflies because it means they can go back to mum. And the Hadza love the testifly because the testifly gets rid of the cattle. And there's all kinds of reasons. Well, you're right to say that the testifly means... Yes, it's kind of a disaster if a man's bought his wife with cattle and then
socially it would quite upset
the emphasis is wrong there, though. The point is the systems remain matrilineal wherever there is prevalence of testify, so you don't get the situation.
The matrilineal belt is a perfectly viable part of Africa where all the societies tend to be matrilineal because no man can get enough cattle to survive to be able to take a wife away because of the flies. But the matrilineal belt, the Bemba and others, for the women it's great because they stay with mum, they stay with the brothers, and so this paper I was mentioning by Ruth Mason and others is called the cow is the enemy of matrilineal. So it's just proving once again that actually what Morgan said and what Engels said is now admitted. Anthropologists, it's not even controversial now. Anthropologists agree that the cow is the enemy of matrilineal, and that if you get rid of the cows, the system reverts to where it was before, to matrilineal. So everyone agrees with that.
I was just thinking that there must have been a lot of confusion in that transition.
Oh yeah, any big transition will cause...
Suddenly belongs to them, not that,
Well, okay.
And then what happens to the man? Does he then follow?
He's got to come. He's got to go and visit his wife now because he's got to do something. As his cattle didn't work, he's now got to do something else, which will mean a lot of bride service. The better way to put it is to say that under a matrilocal system, supposing it's hunters and gatherers tend to be at least I'll come to this later on, but matrilocal residence is kind of the rule with hunters and gatherers. At least early on, a man will have to visit his bride and do bride service for her. So he's got to spend like a lifetime's work to be a husband. Everything he produces then belongs to his in-laws. So you can think now, from the point of view of the in-laws, they're not going to just accept a few cattle and give their female relative away. They need like the equivalent of a lifetime's work. So 40, 50, 60 cattle is a lot. But I'm not saying it really will be the equivalent, but they're certainly going to be moving that direction. So
the brother of the woman needs those cattle to marry.
That's
himself.
right. That's right.
So what's happening is the brother and sister are being divided because the sister brings the cattle that the brother will use to get a wife.
Yeah. So as soon as you get this lobola system, it actually splits the sister and brother apart.
So
I did an experiment in this equivalence of siblings because I was lucky enough that both my sisters proofread my PhD. So they did this very meticulously and competitively. So that was great. So I thought I have to give my sisters a gift. So I decided to give both my sisters and a rather ornate dildo.
But a bit risky for a brother.
Right, that's what they thought, both being married by this thing. So then this put them directly in this dilemma of solidarity with the brother or equivalence of siblings, where this would be a quite, national gift, and the loyalty to the husband. So they both rejected the gift, and obviously had no fun. But it sort
you might have had fun without the dildo.
Well, they could have their husband. So it was just interesting as a kind of something that really got into that conflict that you pointed out.
Okay, I'm going to ponder that. I need to incorporate it.
Sorry, could this then be like the origins of money?
Yeah.
Because if the cattle is doing the same rounds as money does, keep.
The word capital means head of cattle.
Oh.
So capital is initially cattle, and it's the same. But of course, those cattle themselves, what do they represent? They represent female fertility, female sexuality, because you can only get hold of female sexuality through cattle. So ultimately all money is kind of based on that. Yes, no doubt about it.
But the word collateral means pieces of wheat, pieces of cow, whatever. So.
Yeah.
Just going back to Engels and the book,
Yeah.
the point you made, Chris, was one of his main insights was that the first-class divisions in society were divisions between men and women,
Yeah.
and it was the ownership of women and by implication children
Yeah.
by men that was part of the class relations. That's very much a strong point in his book, and there's another point I feel, which is this question of the primitive horde, the primate horde being undermined, the jealousy of males within this primitive horde being undermined by something or another. Engels obviously isn't quite clear what it is, but it's something very important because it seems to usher in culture. For him, the overthrow of male jealousy and male conflict is really quite important. I think those 2 points go together very much. And what I think that the points that you're making about the equivalence of siblings is in some way or another the clarification that we've now got that Engels didn't have. Because he didn't really have the material to...
Well,
it didn't seem as if the work by Morgan was enough to sustain those observations.
Okay. Morgan's 1859 book was called Systems of Consanguinity and Affinity of the Human Family, and he, because Morgan was working with the Smithsonian Institution, he had the support of the American government really to send out questionnaires right around the whole world. His book was a huge compendium of kinship terminologies from around the world, and even to this day, no one's done more than Morgan did to pull together the terminologies of kinship from different cultures. So, I agree with much of what you're saying, but on just that issue of the equivalence of siblings, it wasn't that Engels didn't have data or Morgan didn't have data. Plenty of data. Actually, lots and lots of data, and to this, when Levi-Strauss wrote his elementary structures of kinship, he dedicated it to Morgan because he knew. Morgan's not just any old figure, by the way. Morgan is recognised as the founder of kinship studies. He's a hugely respected figure. So when I use that term, the equivalence of siblings, that's a handy formulation. It's actually Radcliffe Brown's formulation, the equivalence of siblings, and it's a better formulation than Morgan's. Morgan uses the words classificatory versus descriptive. What he's saying is that descriptive means if I say my mum's not feeling very well, the word mum, my mum, describes my mother. It describes a person, so that's descriptive. Whereas classificatory means my mum's not feeling very well. One among a whole class of people isn't feeling very well, so it's called classificatory. But I think that's a bit confusing. So I actually, the one thing I like about Radcliffe Brown is that he hit upon this formulation, the equivalence of siblings, as a fundamental principle. The point is, however, that it's a fundamental principle which is constantly being undermined by other factors, and in particular, this, any kind of male dominance, male jealousy, all that stuff, and in particular, cattle ownership breaks apart the equivalence because the sister has to move away from her brother, and of course what's happening now is that with this transition, every man's putting his control over his wife first. Every man needs to control his wife, and that's going to be at the expense of his sister. He's going to abandon his loyalty to his sister, and his sister, of course, is being abandoned by her brother now because the brother's more interested in controlling his wife. His sister's now going to be controlled by some other man, her husband. So the whole system kind of unravels. So now, just moving on to human origins. As I said, in the 20th century, kind of in scholarly periodicals, in libraries, in private conversations, the establishment knew that this whole overthrow of Engels was kind of nonsense. That each and every one of those great pillars of these new paradigm at Engels' expense was a kind of fraud actually, but it didn't stop people just assuming that kind of one, like they would say, oh, well, even if Burrs got it a bit wrong or Radcliffe Brown's argument wasn't that convincing, we all know that Engels' theory has been superseded. And when it came to human origins in particular, the assumption has always been, right up until now actually, although perhaps not quite so strongly as it once was, that the crucial thing which made us human, the crucial factor was that the human female, unlike the chimpanzee, can be faithful to her husband. So the argument is that in order to get a man to help around the home, to bring meat, to be a good dad, the woman has just got to offer him sexual fidelity. And the argument is that if the man has any suspicions about who his children are, if he thinks that they're maybe not his children genetically, then of course he's not going to be committed to them. And so paternity certainty, the idea of offering certainty of paternity to men is the fundamental thing which got the sexual division of labour up and running, which established food sharing, which established the lengthy juvenile period of dependency, and even things like ovulation concealment and continuous female sexual receptivity. I don't quite know how these arguments are supposed to work. They don't work at all, by the way. But still, the consensus among Darwinians is around the idea that paternity certainty is central. So this is Terence Deacon writing, just to give you a kind of flavour. In evolutionary terms, a male who tends to invest significant time and energy in caring for and providing food for an infant must have a high probability of being its father. Otherwise, his expenditure of time and energy will benefit the genes of another male. And the argument is, of course, that if a male's got certain genetic characteristics and they will only be passed on if he is the father of his offspring. And so the male who doesn't care about that, who just provides maybe care and provisioning kind of anyway, his characteristics won't survive, won't be passed on. It can only be passed on given paternity certainty. And then textbooks to this day impute monogamy to Homo erectus. So this is from a book on the subject. Females may have difficulty providing food for themselves and their dependent young. If Homo erectus hunted regularly, males might have been able to provide high-quality food for their mates and offspring. Monogamy would have increased the male's confidence of paternity and favoured paternal investment. And then, sorry?
Is that correct?
This is Joan Silk. I'm pretty sure it's Joan Silk. 35. Yeah. That's right, Robert Boyd and Joan Silk, How Humans Evolved, Boyd and Silk, 1997.
That is the major textbook today, teaching.
Thank you.
That's a major teaching text.
Major teaching textbook. If you right back with Homo erectus, somehow or other, males managed to get females to be totally faithful. And if they weren't totally faithful, the males wouldn't have provided any food, and if they didn't provide any food, the babies would have died, or they had to be small-brained, and you wouldn't have had a sexual division of labour. Everything that made us human depended on this fidelity to the male and giving him certainty. Or maybe that seems sensible to you. I don't know. Maybe it's quite a yes. Okay. I mean it is a strong Darwinian argument. It can't be played around with. If you've got some genetic feature like being good at providing food or good at hunting, and you give that provision to babies that aren't yours, then whatever it is about you that made you do that isn't going to get passed on, and so it becomes, in evolutionary terms, it becomes irrelevant. So you need paternity certainty. Very powerful argument. And evolutionary psychologist Steven Pinker uses the same idea to explain why the sexual double standard is natural and inevitable. So he writes, sexual jealousy is found in all cultures. True enough. In most societies, some women readily share a husband, but in no society do men readily share a wife. A woman having sex with another man is always a threat to the man's genetic interests, because it might fool him into working for a competitor's genes. Well, a powerful argument, but now why not just for a moment think of it from the woman's point of view? Imagine you're a woman and you need some help because your baby, child-caring burdens are getting quite substantial. Maybe you've got help from your mother, from sisters, and so all those things will go. But what about getting a little bit of help from a man who can go do hunting and bring back some meat? And just think about it. This man may not be around forever. He may get killed. He may get ill. He may get lame. You may stop fancying him after a while. You may, after you've had a baby, you may want another man. Is it a good idea for you as a woman, just thinking back, to give paternity certainty to the men in your life, so that each man in your life knows for sure, when he is the dad, he knows for sure that he is the dad, but when he's not the dad, he knows for sure that he's not the dad? I mean, just think about it. You've got a baby, 2 babies, and there's a new man in your life. You want this new man in your life to feel it really matters that he's not the genetic dad. I would have thought, from a woman's point of view, it would be a good idea to kind of confuse things a bit and make all the men in your life feel that possibly it could be the dad. And anyway, whatever happens, if you've got a new man in your life, you want that new man in your life not to kill or abandon or whatever your baby. I mean, you want it to be nice to you and you're also nice to your baby. Probably you'd want that to be a condition of even having a relationship with the guy that he does. So I'm just saying, if you just think from a male standpoint, you can make quite a powerful argument that you've just got to have paternity certainty. Of course, you've then got to work out how you get that, how you make sure that the woman is going to be totally faithful. Of course, that's another issue. But as soon as you're looking from the female point of view, I think you should be able to see, actually, your priorities will be different. You want whatever, the relationship is, you want the new man in your life to be, maybe in real life he might be more fond of the kid that he's really the dad of, maybe because he's been around a bit, and he may be not quite so keen on the kids that were already there before. But from a woman's point of view, you don't want that to count too much. You want the man to be helpful anyway to all of your babies. So what was happening in the 80s, in the 70s and 80s, was that it was very rare, really, for anyone to think about the female as an active... Well, that's a bit unfair, because from the moment of separate gene theory, feminists were beginning to realise that actually you had to take both sexes into account to work out what was going on in any system. The females have got her strategies, the males have got their strategies. There's going to be an interrelationship, some kind of trade-off, and they're going to get a kind of compromise in any society. But even more interesting is that in response to this, do you remember what I just read? This is Stephen King, I'll just read it again. A woman having sex with another man is always a threat to the man's genetic interest because it might fool him into working for a competitor's genes, and therefore in no society do men readily share a wife. Well, a colleague of ours at East London, Paul Valentine, with a colleague of his, Steve Beckerman, caused a huge sensation in the early part of the century. I think it was about 2002, something like that. They created a book called Cultures of Multiple Fathers. And they demonstrate how the paternity of a woman's baby in many parts of lowland South America becomes partitioned among multiple males. So perhaps instead of reading this out, I'll just explain it quickly and verbally and then read a few quotes. Basically what happens in these societies, and there are many of them, is that a woman gets pregnant and then she makes a decision. There's so many other men in the village, and she might point to, I want sex with you, and then I want sex with you, I want sex with you, as extra dads for my baby. So she's got pregnant by one man, but she wants more than that. She wants several other men to have sex with her while she's pregnant in order to confuse things. We would say in order to confuse things. They wouldn't quite put it that way. They would simply... The scientific theory that the people themselves would have is that actually to make a baby in your womb healthy, you need quite a lot of sperm. And a tiny little bit of sperm isn't enough. So you might have got enough sperm from one man to get you kind of a tiny bit pregnant, but you need to be more pregnant than that. And as you add up the sperm from the different husbands, it's going to make the baby more viable. It'll be better off. So this is Beckerman and Valentine quote this from a classical account of the Amazonian group called the Cane Gang or Tolkling. And this is just a quote from an informant. Clendo's daughter, Passo, is my child, said Vombley. This is a man speaking, Vombley. Clender's daughter, Patho, is my child. How do you know, said I, this is the anthropologist, how do you know, since Clender also lay with her mother? And the informant replies, well, when two men lie with a woman, they just call her child their child. And then the anthropologist, be quoted, continues, but not only do men feel that their mistress's children are their children, but people whose mothers have had intercourse with the same man, whether as lover or husband, regard one another as siblings. So the societies here are ones where different men have sex with the same woman and regard the babies, whoever they are, as their own babies. Each child is going to have several fathers, and that's called partible paternity. Paternity is partitioned out among multiple males. And this partible paternity is widely distributed across lowland South America among, this is a quote, among peoples who live thousands of kilometres apart, speak unrelated languages, and show no indication of having been in contact for centuries. And Beckerman and Valentine conclude, it is difficult to come to any conclusion except that partible paternity is an ancient folk belief capable of supporting effective families that provide satisfactory paternal care of children and manage the successful rearing of children to adulthood. The distributional evidence, that means the evidence across the whole of lowland South America, argues that it is possible to build a biologically and socially competent society, a society whose members do a perfectly adequate job of reproducing themselves and their social relationships, with a culture that incorporates a belief in partible paternity. But not only that, it's not only that the belief in partible paternity seems to work, the anthropologists that Valentine and Beckerman were working with did a longitudinal project, meaning over many decades, taking records of babies and how well they did in life, and then measuring how many dads did the different babies have. Did they have one, or did they have two, or did they have three? So among the hunting and gathering Ashe, children with one extra father are significantly more likely to reach maturity. And they did a thing called the Barry Paternity Project, and Barry Partible Paternity Project, and they found out that although a baby with, say, you can have too much of a good thing. I mean, a baby that's got 4 or 5 fathers, possibly not quite so good. But also a baby with only one father is not very good. So the babies that had the best prospects of surviving were those with, say, 2 dads or maybe 3. And after that, as I say, 4 or 5 is perhaps too many, but 1 is definitely not so good. So you might say, well, this kind of seems to confirm in a funny way this scientific theory that the people have. They say that the baby needs lots of sperm in order to be viable. A little bit isn't enough. But of course, for other reasons we can see, right? Why would it be the case that a baby that's got 2 or 3 men who think they're the father would actually do better? And I think it's fairly clear why they might, because if the first father, the original father, dies or walks away, you're not destitute. The child's got another dad who can step in, believing that he is.
It's a form of insurance.
It's a form of insurance. Exactly, Raga. It's a form of insurance. So it's not in the woman's interest to encourage the men in her life to engage in contests of biological paternity. From a woman's standpoint, the truth is that her current husband may become injured, die, or abandon her. In any event, she may have good reason to switch to a new man. If her new mate suspects that he is not this or that child's father, her existing offspring might suffer infanticide or abuse. Loss of a wanted child is enormously costly to any human mother, making it best not to divulge, but precisely to confuse accurate paternity information, taking extra levels to distribute illusions among multiple males. And then what Beckerman and Valentine do, they show that there's actually, you could use the term battle of the sexes. So in some societies, women have the upper hand. In other societies, the men have more of the upper hand. And in that tussle, depending on which side the men or the women have the most influence and their strategies dominate the most, what pans out is a society which is more or less matrilocal, and which is has more or less of this partible paternity belief. So they write, I think it's worth reading this out. In small egalitarian societies, women's reproductive interests are best served if mate choice is a non-binding female decision. This is what Rag is saying about insurance. If there is a network of multiple females to aid or substitute for a woman in mothering responsibilities, If male support for a woman and her children comes from multiple men, and if a woman is shielded from the effects of male sexual jealousy, male reproductive interests, contrariwise, are best served by male control over female sexual behaviour, promoting paternity certainty and elevated reproductive success for the more powerful males. This profile implies that men choose their own or their sons' wives and their daughters' husbands, that marriage is a lifetime commitment and extramarital affairs by women are severely sanctioned, and that this state of affairs is maintained by disallowing women reliable female support networks or male support other than that of the husband and his primary male consanguine. So you've got a kind of male ideal. Insofar as the men are powerful, their ideal is get hold of that woman, keep anyone else away from her, detach her from her mother, detach her from her sisters, make sure she's faithful, and then you're certain that the babies are yours. So that's the kind of male strategy. But of course the male strategy always comes up against obstacles, because females have their own ideas and their own strategies. And so what we find is the result of these conflicts. There's always some kind of compromise. And just the last part of this quote, where women clearly have the upper hand, matrilocal residence predominates. Women's husbands are often chosen for them by their mothers, or they choose their own husbands. When a woman's husband dies, his children tend to be brought up by their mother, her brothers, and her new husband. Women have broad sexual freedom both before and after marriage. The idea of partible paternity is prominent, with women having wide latitude in choosing the secondary fathers of their children. Women usually make no secret of the identity of these secondary fathers, and the ideology of partible paternity diffuses to some extent potential conflicts between male rivals, antagonisms that are seldom helpful to a woman's reproductive interests in the long run. So, certainly that utterly disproves Pinker's idea that it's impossible. You cannot possibly have men happily sharing a woman between themselves, and it can't possibly, according to Pinker and so many other textbooks, can't possibly be good for women to have anything other than paternity certainty. Now, I think that if Engels were alive, he would be very pleased with all this, because it exactly confirms his own insights in The Origin of the Family, Private Property in the State, when he talked about early human kinship being matrilocal and matrilineal, and early sexual relationships being not at all monogamous, but being much more loose and free, and essentially based on female choice. So here, for the record, is Engels on the subject of male sexual jealousy in evolutionary perspective, and I come to the point that Glyn was making very well, but I can do better because I've got the quotes in front of me. So this is Engels on this. I mean, I mentioned earlier that Westermarck was trying to make out that chimpanzees are monogamous, and orangutans are okay, and the whole of 20th century anthropology via Westermarck and Malinowski kind of went along with it. Absolute, total and utter gibberish, to be honest, just gibberish. And Engels already knew that can't be right. So he wrote as follows: animal societies have, talking about chimpanzees and so on, animal societies have, to be sure, a certain value in drawing conclusions regarding human societies, but only in a negative sense. As far as we have ascertained, the higher vertebrates know only two forms of the family, polygamy or the single pair. In both cases, only one adult male, only one husband is permissible. So he's saying that if you're looking at orangutans, if you're looking at gorillas, if you're looking at chimpanzees, there'll always be the male who's trying to be the alpha male and not very tolerant of the others. But that's an animal system. It's an animal arrangement. And the jealousy of the male, representing both tie and limits of the family, he means that the male is certainly interested in females, wants to attach himself, but of course by doing that he's limiting the scale of the family, because he's stopping the females from being attached to anybody else, as well as, of course, this male, who's the dominant male, is in rivalry with his own competitors, and so it's another fragmentary force. And so this brings the animal family into conflict with the horde. The word horde, he means the wider sort of band or community. We don't use the word horde, particularly these days. So the horde, one of those linguistic problems I was mentioning earlier on. The horde, the higher social form, is rendered impossible here, loosened there, or dissolved altogether during the mating season. At best, its continued development is hindered by the jealousy of the male. This alone suffices to prove that the animal family and primitive human society are incompatible things. Okay? He's saying there's no connection between the chimpanzee type of family and early human kinship. Incompatible, they're opposites. And the primitive man working his way up out of the animal stage either knew no family whatsoever, or at the most newer family that is non-existent among animals. So he's pointing out that these animal systems, I mean, it's fine for if you are a chimpanzee. If you're a female chimpanzee, it's fine. Who needs a male once you're pregnant? Males are completely pointless things to have. Once you're pregnant, and of course, a female chimpanzee is perfectly capable of bringing out the kids all by herself. Males are beyond that; they just provide sperm, and after that, they're just a nuisance, basically. So there's no problem. But for human females, because of the large human brain, the hugely costly childcare involved in bringing up a large brain baby, much more slow to mature, demanding and all that thing, the human female needed help. Not necessarily from a male. Human females need to get support from each other, from grandmother, but also, if you've got males around, you might as well make use of them as well and make them help. And Engels understood that. So Engels posited this decisive social breakthrough. Didn't quite call it a revolution, but you know exactly what Engels was thinking. He was thinking of a revolution. No doubt at all. I can tell from the way he writes here. For evolution out of the animal stage, says Engels, for the accomplishment of the greatest advance known to nature, an additional element was needed, additional to this one isolated, jealous male. The replacement of the individual's inadequate power of defence by the united strength and joint effort of the horde. Mutual toleration among the adult males, freedom from jealousy, was the first condition for the building of those large and enduring groups in the midst of which alone the transition from animal to man could be achieved. And indeed, what do we find as the oldest, most primitive form of the family, of which undeniable evidence can be found in history, and which even today can be studied here and there? Group marriage, the form in which whole groups of men and whole groups of women belong to one another, and which leaves but little scope for jealousy. Well, you can imagine the scandal that the idea of group marriage caused after the First War. I mean, in the 19th century, the late 19th century, these Victorian gentlemen, they weren't too bothered about what savages did. Savages in deepest, darkest Africa, they could be communists, is all they cared, and sexual communists, because we've all evolved after that. We've reached the great pinnacle of Victorian civilization. But after the First World War and the Russian Revolution, they weren't so sure. Nobody, and there was terror. There was absolute terrors of feminism, of course, as you all know from the story of the suffragettes and all that. So at that stage, so suddenly people like Malinowski had to become like priests. The anthropologists had to preserve morality, had to preserve family values, had to inculcate the belief that the nuclear family and fidelity to one's husband are at the core of all order and civilization. And in order to do that, they had to say that actually it's not even a cultural thing, that being faithful to one's husband is part of nature itself, unchangeable. So, okay, now, finally, one of the great things about science is that with science at its best, you kind of have to have faith, I suppose, that your theory will turn out to be right. But you never know for sure. So when I was writing all this stuff in the 60s, 70s, 80s and stuff, I felt I was right. There seemed to be lots of evidence, but you can't absolutely be sure of these things. And then we began to realise that genetics, population genetics, was coming onto the scene, and we got bits of Neanderthal DNA and bits of DNA from here, there, everywhere, and suddenly it all got rather exciting. And I realised, actually, that before long there'd be some genetic proof either way. And it's scary, because it could have come out wrong. The population genetics, especially population genetics applied to Africa, where our species evolved, it could have come out with a very inconvenient result for me. For example, it could easily have come out that if you look at the Y chromosome and the mitochondrial DNA, it could come out that over tens of thousands of years, actually women have been moving to their husband's camp, whereas the husbands have been staying still. Can you all understand that? Mitochondrial DNA is passed to the female line, the Y chromosome is passed to the male line. If over tens of thousands of years women were staying with mum, can you see the particular sequences of MIT DNA will be clustered locally, whereas the Y chromosome DNA would be distributed, because the men would move to their wives and then move again over the generations. The Y chromosome would be dispersed all over the place, and the MIT DNA would be clustered. Okay, well it could have turned out that the genetic would disprove that, and we could have found exactly the other way around. It could be that the women were moving and the men were staying put. So it was kind of a bit scary. But the genetics has come out now as absolutely incontrovertible. I don't want to read out all these papers, but I mean, where are they now? Yeah. What's the point of reading them out? What we now know, I mean, it's come out loud and clear as a signature that over tens of thousands of years in Africa, women, when they're hunting and gathering, a part of hunting-gatherer societies, have been staying put, staying with mother, staying with mother, staying with mother, and that the men have been dispersing. With the farmers, maybe just adjoining the hunter-gatherers in different parts of Africa, but often you've got hunters and gatherers here, and then farmers next door.
Central Africa, Imperials, Western and Eastern Pygmy.
Yes. Okay. So right. Thank you. Okay. So if you take the hunter-gatherers, so the Congo Basin, the Pygmy groups, then take the Hadza, and then take Southern Africa with the Bushmen.
They haven't done this on the Hadza. They've done it with the
They haven't?
Bushmen.
No,
They've done
okay.
it with the Bushmen.
Do you want to?
Sorry.
No, it's fine. No.
To be true and to be exact.
Yeah.
So there are some early results that those papers you referenced in this one, Destra Bizol and others, where they did. They're always changing their methods in genetics, and I don't understand them, and I can't keep up with them. But so the genetics literature is just changing all the time. But they confirm, they get a refined method, and they go back to what they did before. So they confirmed in sort of two completely different methods. Destra Bizol, earlier one, some Western Pygmy groups with the hunter-gatherers, you say, mitochondrial DNA localised, the Y dispersed. And then subsequently Verdun and his colleagues, the same again, the mitochondria localised the Pygmy groups. The opposite way around with the Bantu and the farming groups. And so the farmers do the other way.
Yeah.
And in the Khoisan, which is really interesting because Khoi they're also Khoisan, they're pastoralist groups, that if they've got cattle, the Y chromosome stays localised and the DNA disperses. If they're hunting heritage, then it will be the other way.
Yeah.
It's always local. Now, something even more interesting has happened that is highly relevant for Engels, is they've just very recently, got a result on historic Neolithic farmers, which is exactly what you would expect for farming in relation to Engels' history of the stages, DNA dispersed Y chromosome states, which is exactly what we see. And we kind of knew that with
And also, there's also the issue of...
that's old, that's like several thousand years, tens of thousands.
Neolithic.
So
In Europe or in
recent.
Africa?
This is European.
In Europe.
This is the spread of farming in Europe.
And also, wherever farming spreads,
from Middle East.
you get a massive inequality between males in terms of reproductive success. There's another result.
A really interesting
go
one,
on.
because that reflects on the class idea of Engels.
Yeah, that's right.
That as soon as you hit roughly between 4,000 to 8,000 years ago, the amount of diversity on Y chromosomes suddenly reduces, whereas the amount of diversity on female lineages stays just what it was before.
Yeah.
So women are just carrying on having roughly the same number of babies, everybody, but suddenly a restricted number of men start having babies.
So
And this is the ultimate sort of class inequality.
So
it's
stratification.
wealth accumulation.
as soon as you get
means some men get more wives and some get none.
That's right. And then you get the Genghis Khan.
It's coinciding. Well, the ultimate extreme is Genghis Khan, who's supposedly the ancestor of half the people of Asia.
Half of us are all got Genghis Khan as a granddad.
So that is a 4,000 to 8,000 year window. So it's going with farming and domestication.
Is this why there's so little diversity, genetic diversity outside Africa? Could this tie
No,
into it?
because that would be for bottlenecks from much older. No, that's from like 60,000 on.
Okay.
So this is
So
not the same.
can I just finish this? So now that genetic stuff, it doesn't tell you about descent. It doesn't tell you really whether there's kinships with matrilineal or patrilineal.
Yeah.
But what it does tell you is whether women were living with mum or moving out and living with their husband's family. It does tell you that. And so the genetics is now confirming the fundamental point that Engels was making about women's power and solidarity, because it's making clear that women resisted breaking up from their mum and grandmother and sisters and moving to be isolated in a monogamous relationship with their husband. And now that also corresponds with the consensus among social anthropologists. The consensus being that hunter-gatherers, it's a bit too crude to say hunter-gatherers are consistently matrilocal, but it's certainly true that for the crucial first years of married life for a woman, she will be living with her mum and making the man come to visit her. And when they've looked at foraging societies or hunter-gathering societies around the world, the consistent finding they've got is that mother and daughter stay together. So an older woman will want to be with her daughter and her daughter's children, and whatever other arrangements they're going to try to keep to that one. And that's true of the Hadza as well. Among the Hadza, that's
shown with the Hadza in terms of actual kinship records.
So a census among the Hadza showed 68% of married women whose mothers were alive residing with them in the same camp. Across all societies, concludes Frank Marlowe, the greater the dependence on gathering, hunting and fishing, the less likely is residents going to be patrilocal. Hunting is the strongest effect and results in less patrilocal. So the more the society is reliant on hunting, the more likely is the residents' rule going to be matrilocal. And of course the reason for that is because, again, cross-culturally, males contribute less. You would expect this, wouldn't you? When they can take their bride back to their own camp, more when they're obliged to visit their bride who remains living among her own kin. It's clear, it's obvious that if a man has got to work in order to have his marital rights, he's going to have to do more work if his bride is living with her mum and kin. They're going to demand more of him. If the man's allowed to take his wife back home, obviously he can take her for granted, and it's going to be so. If the amount of labour depends on bride service, it's going to be much higher where residence is matrilocal than when it's patrilocal. Now that's the present. That's hunter-gatherer today. But on what grounds can we claim that resident pattern characterised early human kinship? Well, we already know about the genetics we've just been discussing about residence. But another really important was two really important bodies of theory, which are not just fairly respectable, but very influential, highly respected bodies of theory. One is called the grandmothering hypothesis, and one is called mothers and others or cooperative breeding hypothesis. So Christian Hawkes and her colleagues, Kristen Hawkes and her colleagues came up with the grandmothering hypothesis. According to this hypothesis, the selective advantage of distinctively human post-menopausal lifespans, in other words, growing older beyond reproductive age, is that it enabled older women to assist their adult children in caring for and provisioning grandchildren. And of course, in genetic terms, a woman can never be as certain of her son's offspring as she can be of her daughter's. For grandmothers to invest preferentially in their descendants through sons, therefore, would not be an evolutionarily stable strategy. So can you see you can apply all this Darwinian stuff that other people come up and say paternity certainty. You can say, right, if women are living longer because it makes sense for them to invest in their daughters' children, those women know that their daughters' children are really their daughters' children. If the grandmothers were to live with and bond with their sons, then that same argument applies in reverse now, because of course you can never be as certain an older woman can never be as certain that her grandkids are really her grandkids if they're her son's offspring. Now, of course, the advocates of the patrilocal band model who are still around, they can just argue, all right, maybe the grandmother somehow managed to make sure that her son's wife was faithful. But that's not so easy. That's actually quite difficult. And even if you manage to make the son's wife fairly faithful, you can't be as certain of your son's offspring as you can of your daughter's offspring. So as soon as you've got the grandmother hypothesis, it's giving you matrilocal residence. It's giving you women living with their daughters. Otherwise, the grandmothering thing strategy wouldn't work in Darwinian terms. And then just finally, it's now, as we've been describing, widely accepted that our species evolved quite recently in Africa. From about 500,000 years ago, brain size began increasing exponentially. An infant with an outsized brain imposes heavy burdens on pregnant and nursing mothers. And so when you look at this increase in brain size, you're asking, right, how was it that evolving humans were able to afford those costs, the costs of producing such heavily dependent, slow maturing babies. What new sources of energy were they tapping into? Well, one of them would have been women's own mother, but we also know that they would have been getting support from each other as women. But the question arises, what about the males? Now, it is unknown for a non-human primate male to systematically provision a pregnant or nursing female. There's no chimpanzee, no gorilla male ever does anything by way of providing food or provisioning for the female. They want sex, and after that they want more sex, basically. And so, the chimpanzee males, they're interested in the estrus. They're interested in females who are showing an estrus swelling, because then the male can get them pregnant. Once they are pregnant, the males aren't nearly as interested in those females. So, and then, where a female is nursing an infant, with chimpanzees, there's some danger that local males who feel suspicion regarding the paternity of that infant may be attempted to kill and eat it. So, in other words, not only are the males not very helpful, they actually might eat your baby. And infanticide is a real possibility for primate females. And of course, then you think about it, what's infanticide going to do to population levels? Clearly, a population where infanticide is rife isn't going to expand at all. It may even shrink, and the whole population the males might do well, but meanwhile they're doing well in a shrinking pool until that particular group become extinct. Now, according to current models, I don't know quite what the latest figures are about all this, estimates of populations in prehistory. Population size at one point, we're talking about ourselves now, so we're talking about modern Homo sapiens. We're all one species, we all came out of Africa around 70,000 years ago, but it's widely agreed that at one point, our ancestors in Africa may have resembled a modern endangered species, like mountain gorillas, just a few thousand individuals. And then something amazing happened. The population just mushroomed and expanded, across Africa, and then it burst out of Africa and went across the world. And population expansion on such a scale is inconsistent with mothers having to put up with infanticide, harassment, or the unaffordable costs of male philandering and double standards. If unusually large numbers of unusually large-brained offspring were being successfully raised to maturity, the quality of childcare must have been exceptional. And we know what the optimal solution would have been. Sarah Hurley's written this wonderful book, Mothers and Others, to explain how we are the babysitting ape. We're the only ape where the mothers are sufficiently trusting of others to be able to hunt together. You allow your baby to be looked after by others. A chimpanzee would never let go of a baby to another female, because you never know what she might do with it. There's just not enough trust. Because of the sexual rivalries and competitions, each female has to look after her own baby. So in our case, there can be no doubt that mothers would have done best by cooperatively resisting male sexual control, relying for protection on supportive male and female kin, motivating multiple suitors to work hard for them, and taking advantage of every available childcare resource. And the evidence is that we're all here today. Communism works, or did work.
I think you should read the piece from the missionary to show how Engels prefigured the rights service and the leverage of the rights service. You didn't read it.
Lots of things I didn't read, Camilla.
Yeah, but I think that's a bit critical,
okay.
Isn't it? You know what I mean?
Yeah, I know. That's right. Yeah.
It just shows how,
yeah.
because that is actually the point where he comes closest.
Right.
To
well done. Okay.
hunter-gatherer economics.
Okay. Right. So we're now. This is a missionary who knew about the Iroquois system of Seneca Iroquois. I mentioned earlier on these long-houses. Lovely pictures of them. Actually, you can find it. They're old engravings. A great long house. From the outside, it looks like a long barracks actually, made of wood, birch bark covered, with say 9, 12 maybe hearths, and a woman in charge of each hearth. And this is Usher Wright writing a letter to Morgan. This is one of the sources that Morgan had for his book. As to their family system, when occupying the old longhouses, communistic households comprising several families, it's probable that some one clan predominated, the women taking in husbands, however, from the other clans. So they just take these husbands in, the husband would stay the night and then go back home to their sisters and mothers. Usually the female portion ruled the house. The stores were in common, but woe to the luckless husband or lover who was too shiftless to do his share of the providing. No matter how many children or whatever goods he might have in the house, he might at any time be ordered to pick up his blanket and budge. And after such orders, it would not be helpful for him to attempt to disobey. The house would be too hot for him. He must retreat to his own clan. The women were the great power among the clans as everywhere else. They didn't hesitate when occasion required to knock off the horns, as it was technically called, from the head of a chief and send him back to the ranks of the warriors. So what you're seeing here is an example among the Iroquois that Morgan knew personally of what I've called sex strike. I mean, in other words, sex isn't just taken for granted. A man can't just say, right, you said yes when I married you, and therefore I've got to have the sex. Women make this decision themselves, and although the women like sex, they don't just want a man turning up with his equipment. I mean, they want a man turning up to the house with something useful for the babies, for everybody else, and preferably if it's a hunting society, he better come with a moose or something, and then the women really fancy him. And if he's lazy and shiftless and there's a useless hunter and on purpose, he's not going to get any sex. He would say, and the women
Heads of women will say, if you can't hunt, we just get rid of him.
Yeah.
They live with their mums, they've got the house.
Yeah.
Off you go.
So in a way, sex is the incentive system. It's the motivating force. Men don't go hunting because they're feeling hungry. Men go hunting because they want to prove that they're men. And if they can't prove that they're men in women's eyes because they're too lazy or whatever, that's. I mean, what happens in a matrilineal system? Of course, the man's not going to go hungry. He'll go back to his mum, and he can be as lazy as he likes. He'll still get fed, but he won't get a lot of sex.
Chris, I wonder if any regard would be made of somebody's disability if a man, for some reason, doesn't have the capacity to hunt well. He may have other attributes.
Well, that's the good thing about collectivism, isn't it? Because this is a rather important point, because certainly in the earlier stages, before you had more sophisticated technology like poison arrows, to hunt a large animal, you need a big group of you.
Yeah.
So as long as he had some knowledge, maybe good eyesight, maybe good at making the weapons, having a big part of the plan. Yes, that's right. I mean, it wouldn't.
Metalsmiths usually lame in mythology as well, isn't it?
Metalsmiths are usually lame. Not quite sure how that's relevant, but.
They can't hunt. You're saying that they tended to work with metal because they weren't able to hunt?
In mythologies, they're always.
But we're talking about
hunter-gatherers. This is all way pre-metal, so it's.
Types of, that's amongst the metallurgy.
Metallurgy
is the late barbarism stage.
The crucial thing is, it doesn't matter how lazy you are or disabled, you won't starve.
No, exactly.
So, and if women fancy you, you'll have sex. But you've got to be some way useful. You've got to some way make yourself useful.
Ways, being a musician, being
You could have charm as well. You could be charismatic.
You could have charm. You could be charismatic. Yes, I have a very good idea. Tea break.